This one. All right. Thanks everyone for joining the GPA's first workshop or webinar. We're really pleased to have Sven Teurlincx with us from the Netherlands Institute for Ecology. He's going to talk today about managing budgets and projects in science. Over to you, Sven.
Yes, welcome to what is probably going to be the most exciting slide deck you've seen in a long time. I now finally know how economists feel. They must feel very sort of jealous of all the nice lake pictures we can put in. Um, as a little bit of an introduction to where I'm coming from, and ending with the note that anything I say today is purely based on personal experiences, and you are more than welcome to disagree with me at any point. Do not hesitate to jump in halfway. If you have a question or you think, hey, but I think something's more like this, by all means, just speak up. Don't wait until the end. I might tell you at some point, yeah, I'll get to it. So this is me in my natural environment, I would say. But most of the work I do has always had some connection with society as a whole. And when you work a lot with people in the societal domain, per definition, you end up in a lot of projects and things that somehow include stakeholders. I actually started my PhD in a quite classical funded project, just what is standard in the Netherlands is 4 year of PhD project. I had a 4 year funded PhD project. I didn't need to get any of my own money in that process. And I just did that. And that was Dutch science funding money. After that, I switched to soft money funding for both postdoc project as well as my follow-up, where I was literally labeled as a project leader slash project manager and eventually a researcher. I am now, for the first time in 10 years, no longer completely dependent on my own research funding as of last March. So for me, that's a new experience. So most of the time, I've been working on soft money. If we then talk about projects, my projects have ranged anywhere from 1,600 euros to 2.8 million. So that's a fair range, I would say. They've also lasted anywhere between a few months to 6 years. Um, that's what I'm basing what I'm talking about today on. All of these are personal experiences. You're free to disagree. And just to give you a bit of an insight, when I first started off trying to make my own funding in science, that was a 1,600 euro project. I was insanely nervous about this, to the point where if I did all the nice calculations, we had to charge the people 1,600 euros, and they actually asked if we could do it for 14 initially. And I felt very elated to ask them for 200 euros more. If you would ask me if I would do the same at the moment, I wouldn't even bat an eye at it. And that has to do with experience more than anything else, and maybe a bit of um, realization that at the end of the day, none of this is personal for when you're dealing with money in this respect. So these look like very big numbers sometimes. They're not my personal bank account. That is a first startup to give to you that it might be worth considering that when you're talking about budgets and science. None of this is about your own bank account. It's not personal. Um, when we then dive into funding applications, I'm not going to tell you where to apply for funding. It depends greatly on country. It depends greatly on region. It varies what you like doing. But more than anything, what I will tell you is if you're applying to a funding agency, independent of whether that is a government, a non-government, a privately owned fund, you name it, always follow the rules. That sounds very basic, But a lot of these rules are sort of detail oriented, and the easiest way to not get your funding is to not have followed the rules correctly and just get tossed out in that process. So whatever you do, just follow the rules. Even if you think they're stupid, still follow them. Not unimportantly in that is also submit things on time. What you see is in the sort of more classical science funding scheme, we're quite used to having quite long lead ups. What I mean with that is months to prepare grant applications are fairly standard. Um, in some of the governmental funding and definitely also the non-profit funding, sometimes these are much shorter time frames of weeks. The most important thing to do if you want to have a chance to get funding is get something in. If you don't get anything in, can't play, you can't win. Um, Having said that, of course, you still want something that you put in to be something you want to do, right? We're not in the business of getting money. We're in the business of doing science. So a lot of this might seem very transactional, and that's partly because when you talk about money, it's easy to get that way. But I would also like to stress, at the end of the day, you want to be doing stuff you actually think is relevant somehow to your research career. That said, why would we want to get what would be the reasons for taking up a project? I essentially try to outline three basic ones here, and that is they all start with a C, so that's easy to remember. It's cash, career, or curiosity. Um, let's start with cash. I want something and I need money to pay for it. That can be equipment, that can be certain staff, that can be a lab upgrade. And I can find some financing instrument that will actually let me do that. Um, there's, of course, also the more career focused ones. This is things that further your institute's scientific goal and ambition. Very often, this, in contrast to the cash one, the career one really has to fit with your actual primary research interest first and foremost. If it doesn't, it's not worth doing. Um, the cash one might be something that's a bit more sideways, but it's something you can easily do. For instance, think about setting up a analysis pipeline for someone. It might not immediately lead to a scientific paper, but it could maybe pay for something that allows you to do something you find interesting down the line. E.g., buy yourself a new computer, um, be able to travel to a conference, you name it. Then, of course, there's curiosity. Not an unimportant driver, might align with some of the other ones, but these are the projects where you essentially wanted to do the project anyway, and somehow you found someone that said, hey, I'm actually willing to pay you because it aligns with some of my goals. In that one, it's very important to keep in mind the moment you let someone pay for it, that also probably means someone wants something out of it, and whether or not that actually aligns with your goals is worth considering. Um, if we then think about these in terms of budgets, if it's about cash, you better make sure the budget pays for all costs and ideally more than that, because you're not doing this for the scientific output, you're doing it because you wanted something out of it. If it only pays for half of your instrument, that's problematic because you probably need the whole instrument to do something with it. If we look more from the career perspective, so we look for things that are really important to either you yourself or your institutes or institution. You can also get into a situation where it's not just about paying all relevant costs, but there might be some co-financing involved. So the institute itself may be willing to pay for some of it, or you could even look at some other money you have lying around, for instance, from the first road to co-finance another another piece of research. Then if we're going to the third one, the curiosity, essentially the budget becomes largely irrelevant because you're doing it, you would have done it anyway. But you want to make sure you get something nice out of it, so it pays for something you can use down the line. And an important one there is to make sure you're doing this in a way that um, doesn't lead to extra costs by making it a project. What I mean with that is it's really nice if you were doing something you found cool. If you make it into a project and someone starts paying for it, there's the risk that you start doing extra work. Then make sure that extra work is either something you really also wanted to do, or at the very least is being paid for by whoever is requesting. Um, Very often, making curiosity-driven projects into an action or research into an actual project goes through informal channels. What I mean by that is you're talking to someone and you're telling them about this really cool thing you have planned or you're actually doing, and they say, "Well, I see this or that use for it, and could we expand that, or could you deliver on this for me?" And that either works or it doesn't work. They're not very often going to be going through formal application procedures. Um,
Sven, can I ask a question?
yeah, sure.
How often do you find that these different drivers overlap, or are they fairly exclusive?
No, I would say they can overlap to some extent, um, but the incentives are fairly different. So you could do this within the context of the project. You could have one part that is really curiosity driven. You just want to do it, and you don't actually care if it gets funded or not because you're doing it anyway. And then part of it you don't find that interesting, but you just, as long as it makes some money, that's fine. And then there's the core of it, core of the research application in that sense would be the career path. So they could all be there. It's not mutually exclusive. Um, Nonetheless, I think it's worthwhile to consider all of them. And one of the reasons is because the scale might be quite different. And what I mean with when I say scale, it's the um, size of such a project. If we look at we'll start at the bottom. The curiosity-driven projects tend to be fairly small um, in amount of budget that they account for because these are things you were either doing anyway. So either this is part of your core work, so why should you get a lot of money in by doing so? But very often there's little side things or little startup parts that could lead to more focused research proposals. And if they're really big already, that's going to be pretty hard to sustain while doing all your other work. Um, these are very often also the little tiny, really interesting side projects that seemed hard to fund or things that got out of hand and suddenly became a project. If we look then to the top, to the cash one, this should be substantial. If this is a really tiny, tiny project, it's probably not worth doing to get the cash in. For instance, as an example, some of the first projects I did were really cash focused. When I started working on soft money, they had absolutely no chance of leading to a scientific paper. And looking back, they were way too small to be sustainable. What I mean, why I say that is because if you're doing something for a very small amount of money, that in practice means um, by the time you're actually starting the work, you don't have a lot of capacity left to actually do something. And then, well, you know you're going to spend all of the money you made doing the actual work. So it's not a great move to do for cash. Um, what that amount is varies so substantially across the world that it's hard to put a number on. But for me, in my setting, that break-even point is around 10K. If it's less than 10K, it's not really worth doing. unless I really, really find it super interesting. So for me, then it would veer into curiosity. Now, the career ones are generally substantial to large grants. Um, why? Because that's your primary funding mechanism, right? Um, so those are my three main ways and perspectives to look at what sort of projects we might be looking at. Now, what do we actually budget in projects? Let's start with direct costs. Direct costs are essentially all things that are being paid directly from the project itself. So this is everything you might want to try and write into a project. Um, those are the salaries of all the people involved. That can be PhDs, postdocs, research assistants, but don't forget potentially yourself. Not an unimportant one. Um, whether or not you can fund any or all of those really depends on the grant. Generally speaking, um, I would say that the non-traditional science funding leaves a lot more room for funding whatever in terms of personnel relative to the science funding. It is quite uncommon for an NGO to specify the type of personnel you can hire. It is quite common for national or international science funders to do so. Um, then we get to the other side of salaries, and those are bench fees, which is one of these words that gets thrown around and might mean slightly different things depending on who's on your funder and on your institute. But in essence, these should be costs for shared desk, lab space, things like that. They can sometimes be put on projects. Very often that is a fixed number that you can claim. And they should always, this is the one commonality that I've come across, directly benefit the project personnel and be usable to them. Very often this is even specified in call texts that if you apply for bench fee, the bench fee has to come to the benefit of the research or the researcher. It's not uncommon for your institute to try and claim these nonetheless as overhead. We'll get the overhead in a minute. Um, then we move on to lab supplies. Lab supplies are essentially all stuff or field supplies, I would call those, put those under this, are essentially materials you buy. And then when you start talking about materials, we cannot avoid talking about value added taxes. Sadly enough, most countries have some form of these. They are called differently everywhere. And exemption to these are also quite common. Um, does any of that make any logical sense without talking to someone that actually knows what they're doing in terms of taxes? No. There are many different types of exemptions. You can imagine, for instance, just talking about the Dutch situation for a sec, we are a tax exempt institute unless we do commercial work, then we are not. Then, however, that being tax exempt in practice means that we do pay taxes over our materials, but we don't pay taxes on our personnel. I don't know why that makes sense. I had a colleague at finance that always said the following about value added taxes: where value added taxes start, logic ends. So you just need someone that actually knows what they're doing. This is where you go to your finance department and say, I want to buy this sort of stuff on my project. What should I account for? Also, do not assume that the price you pay on Amazon is the price you would actually pay in a project. Why not? Because in many cases, you will either need to buy it from a given set of suppliers because those have been tendered, which means that your organization has some sort of agreement that they buy, say, 80 or 90% of everything in that category from that given supplier. And that can make things cheaper. It can also make things way more expensive in some cases. So always make sure you're looking at the right suppliers. And again, that is really a question of asking within your institute, where am I allowed to buy this? Can I just order this from my favorite Amazon company or from that local guy up the street, or do I need to go to a certain supplier? Then when we move to equipment, you might think this is just another word for lab supplies. It really isn't in the budget sheet, sadly enough, because this is generally stuff that is relatively expensive and has to be depreciated. And this is where we come into the wondrous world of depreciation, which essentially means um, the stuff isn't bought at in this year and paid off in this year, but is paid off over multiple years. That means that your project might have the funding to buy it, but if it gets depreciated over more years than your project has, there might be leftover value after your project that you still need to pay for somehow. In other words, say you have a 1 year project, but it takes 3 years to depreciate said item, there might be a lot of cost left that you don't have project funding for. So that's one of these things when things get too expensive, when they become equipment, and when an institute or a country considers that may depend. It's many oftentimes it's the institute that decides that. Um, you might be in a totally different ballgame in terms of how to deal with that. Again, talk to your financial people when you think, hey, I'm buying something relatively expensive. Um, Generally speaking, we are talking laptop prices and up to give you some ballpark. We're not talking about, I don't know, bottles, flasks, that sort of thing. Those things are really just consumables and fall under lab supplies. Then there's travel and field work, and luckily this is a relatively easy category. You just budget what you think you need, and you make sure you don't go over the amount that is allowed based on your funding scheme. So this is the easy one. No additional comments on that one. Besides, make sure you budget enough. Then we get to the wondrous world of indirect costs, the thing very often labeled overhead. And I'm guessing if you ask around in your institutes, at least half the scientists find overhead to be stupid because it's just them taking money that I could have used for my research. Um, Overhead is essentially what is used to pay all things that aren't directly research costs. So you can think of anything from the electricity bill to your security services, maintenance, emptying the trash cans, you name it. Um, some of that overhead may be claimed back on your project. That can happen in two ways. Either because it's budgeted in, so you're allowed to claim some of it at your financing instrument. Again, that will vary wildly what the financing instrument allows you to do, right? So if you apply to the Dutch Science Foundation, you can claim a total of 0% overhead. If you apply to the EU, it's usually at around 25%. If I go to a random NGO, it might be whatever we think is reasonable, and that could go up to, I don't know, 40 to 80% of personnel costs, which is quite an amount. Um, they also vary wildly per organization. So some organizations have a base overhead that they would like to incur of about 40%, some have 80 or more. Make sure you know what it is and what it means within your institute, how to go about that. Because the last thing you want is ending up with the idea that you got a lot of money in, only to figure out you actually are gonna get a huge bill from your institute saying you owe us for about 80% of this entire research funding. Not the best experience to have. So do check this. Also, because it's very good to, in the end, we do actually need a lot of these services, right? So the statement, it's just money I could have spent on research, yeah, of course, I would have loved to spend it on research, but at the end of the day, if I hire someone and they need to go they need to get a visa, for instance, I'm very happy there's someone in this institute that can help them with that, rather than me having to figure out how the Dutch immigration process works. So it is paying for something you're actually using. That said, this in the end ascends to a form of resource management. Not water resources management, but definitely project resources management. A key aspect you heard me say it a few times already is get help, but also get help early in this process. If you wait until the very end when it's near your deadline because you really wanted to get your research idea crystallized out, and then you need to get help with the budget from someone in finance, you're making their life harder, but you're also making it less likely that things are gonna work out well. Um, Very often, what you can do within your research will be constrained by the budget. So knowing what your budget is and what your budget can accommodate is actually quite important quite early on in formulating your research idea. Um, Not unimportantly, even though a lot of people like to first talk about what they want to do conceptually and figure out what the most interesting idea is, sometimes it's better to just have the fight over who gets what money fairly early on in the process, because if you can't figure that out as a research group or a research consortia, um, well, how are you actually going to work together downstream? The most annoying thing I've personally encountered is people having to fight over money 2 days before the application deadline because you're stuck with all these partners. You have no chance to take anyone off, but we're still fighting about who gets what part of the pie. I'd rather do that 3 months in advance and have to kick someone out because of it. As nasty as that is, it's more nasty to have it later. Um, So do address it fairly early on. And of course, there is always things might evolve in those 3 months, and you might figure out, oh, this partner needs a little bit more, this needs a little bit less, but don't wait too long with that. Also, if you're one of those partners, it's nice to know what you can expect because that's going to shape your research idea. Now, we got our project funded, we got some money. What do we need post-project application? There's essentially two phases to consider. There's essentially we got funded. Does stuff still have to happen before our project can start? And then once we start, we move up to the point where there's completion of said project with some outcomes. Um, I haven't grouped them according to these, but this is good to consider that once you get your funding, that doesn't mean your project has actually started. There might be a lot of things legally that have to happen. First off, there will need to be contracts and agreements made between different research partners if they exist. So if you're in a consortium with more than one partner, even if one of them is only collaborating with you but not actually receiving money, you still have to agree upon some basics of what you do together, what you share or don't share, who gets what, who gets to own what, if there's any talk about that. Or even things like we will make everything open because we really believe in open science. Um, then, of course, there's a legally binding contract with your funder. They're giving you money and they probably expect you to do stuff with that money and deliver on that. So there will be a contract in place. That contract is, all of these contracts are legal and all of them are in legal terms. What you want to, the best way to do it ideally, in my experience, is to write down what you think the project, what you think should happen in the project. Um, in terms of that agreement, what do you think really should be in there? And have a conversation based on that with your legal, with essentially your legal team at your institute if you have one. If you do not have one, go to some of the standard formats. For instance, the EU has a standard um, format for research consortia. It's quite good. It's quite extensive. See what is in there. Take out what you think you don't need. If you're unsure if you need it, you might be better off leaving it in. It's better to have an agreement in place if something happens than not have an agreement in place at all. Um, all of these things are there for worst case scenarios. We're not making agreements for if everything just goes smoothly. We're making them for if shit hits the fan, to put it unelegantly. So a lot of this will feel very harsh in terms of its wording. It will feel very constraining. It's meant to be that because goes into effect if somehow you really end up in a massive disagreement that you can't figure out based on normal conversations anymore. Say a partner steps out or a partner suddenly decides not to deliver on something, you need to take the next step in the research. Um, does this happen often? No, no. The good news is almost never. But if it does, you're very happy at it. Um, then also, once you get the contract and agreement with the research partners and the funders out of the way, there might be some legal obligations, such as ethical approvals to get, or required permits to do your fieldwork in certain cases. You need to get all of those in place as well. Some of those you might be able to do once the research is already running, some you can't. Very often, for most permits and approvals, the concept is prior informed consent. So whoever gives that permit needs to agree with that before you actually do it. Um, if you already did some of the research but you didn't get your permits, probably you did it for nothing because it's not going to be useful and it's not. And increasingly, journals are getting more aware and more strict on that. So if you try to publish something that should have gone through animal ethical approval without animal ethical approval, good luck. Um, then, of course, very often we want to hire personnel. Now, the interesting part is there's two things in place there. There is your institution that determines the procedure for hiring. So I don't get to say anything on that except follow those rules. But then also the funder sometimes sets procedures in place that you have to follow. Generally speaking, if your institute agreed to take money from said funder, they also implicitly agreed to follow the procedure of said funder. Of course, you want to make sure that people are aware of that. It would not be the first time that someone walks into HR saying, well, we're going to do the procedure like this, and HR goes, what? That's not our procedure. No, it's not, but we agreed to take money from these people, so now we have to. Better to have informed them beforehand. So if you notice that there's a procedure in place for hiring, in the application phase, notify your HR person. Tell them, hey, we're going to apply for this funding. That means we're going to use this procedure if we get it. I would always do this via email, so you have a paper trail. That sounds real nasty, but again, at the end of the day, these people might get 18 million of these people walking in saying, well, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're doing that. Have it on paper. It's nice and it's there. You can point back to it. Also, if you have a large HR department, you might have talked to that person then and another person another time. Um, once you have your once you're looking at hiring, really get help from HR, but also your other colleagues in drafting text for job ads. The better the text is, the better it fits the position and the type of person you're looking for, the better applicants you'll get, in my experience. Fake, overly broad job ads get a lot of applications. That's a lot of work to go through, and you don't necessarily get the best. Um, always check project requirements as well, because sometimes your project can only start if there is dedicated personnel hired. That's a rather weird one. It pops up quite often with national science funders because they say you need to hire certain types of personnel, and only when the personnel is hired does the project start. But then there might also be deadlines at when the project has to start at the latest. So you need to align the hiring procedure with the project start time. Not unimportant to flag. Um, then, last but not least, when you start no, almost last, one before last, I think. Projects tend to have all sorts of things we need to deliver on. Pretty much always something has to be delivered. That can be a report, that can be some form of output, you name it. It can be a data analysis pipeline, a tool, whatever. Some results, all good, but something has to be delivered. If you are writing down deliverables in a project proposal, don't overpromise because you will probably have these end up in your contract that you have, and then you have to deliver on them. Of course, that doesn't mean you can't write a project where you make a case that things are really important and really should be developed, but the concrete deliverable that you agree on, make sure that is feasible and manageable in the time frame and the budget you have. If it isn't, that means that either you end up with a failed project or you end up with difficult conversations down the line to explain why did we only deliver half of what we promised. Now, timely deliverables of reports, outputs, etc. are great. Ideally, strive for them, but more than anything, strive for timely communication. We're doing research. We're not in the process of um, essentially being a cookie factory. So the fact that we cannot always deliver exactly what we planned, nor on the time frame that we planned, is not irrational nor illogical to have. But make sure you communicate that with your funder and with your stakeholders that depend on it and with your other research partners. Very often there are procedures in your contract of how to deal with that. So, for instance, the Dutch national funder, you make a small note and you tell them, and everything's usually fine, but there is a formal procedure. With the EU, it's a massive amendment process. Either way, you have to go through it. It is not fun to go through, it never is, but you're better off doing it than not delivering while you should have delivered. Then, this I think is really my last one. Not unimportantly, while you're running your project and especially after your projects, there might be auditing by accountants, specifically of the project as a whole, or sometimes by within the context of your organization. So nearly all organizations, one way or the other, have an accountant that checks the books. That could be a line from your project, but very often if projects get a bit bigger, they also have to be checked specifically as a project as a whole to get a declaration from the accountant. What does that accountant do? They check how the money was spent. They do that by looking at time spent on the project and whether or not that time adds up with where you actually were, for instance. If you were traveling for a project and you signed a sheet of paper saying, yes, I was here on that day, but you didn't write any hours on the project on that day, that's a red flag. If you travel for a project, but there is actually no travel expenses made of how you got there, that's odd. How did you manage to magically appear there? If you bought materials for a project, but those materials make no sense given the type of work you're doing, that might be a problem. So all of these things you really want to approach from that perspective. Is it checkable and can we lead it back in a good way? Now, normally your finance department should really be helping you out with them, but keeping in contact there is very good. Definitely, if you know the project is getting audited, it is worth really doing this from day one onwards, having a good conversation. What do we really need? What do we need to do in what way? And how do we make sure we don't have a problem in 3 years from now? Um, Generally speaking, as weird as it sounds, the indirect costs are the easy one here because they're usually just a percentage. So this is the one you actually hear, you don't have to worry about anymore. Once that's agreed upon, it's easy. For the rest, it's really very often your prerogative, but also your responsibility as a project leader or project manager to keep an eye on this, both for yourself, but also for all the personnel you hire that they are aware of this. So, yeah, it's not a fun job, but it is the end result, if you don't do it well, is worse. Because then you might end up with a project where part of the cost can't be declared. And then the institute is upset. You're upset because you don't get all the money you expected to get. And usually the accountant is also upset, so it's not necessarily a nice place to be. That said, um, I would like to thank specifically my colleagues in the finance department who spent 10 years trying to get me to do all of this in a nice way, and I still, on many occasions, don't follow the rules all that well and get called back on that in a nice way, luckily. Um, and I think that's my last take-home message would be sometimes it's okay to apologize after having done something wrong, rather than worry too much about making mistakes, because you will undoubtedly make them. And that's what I have for you.
Thanks so much, Sven. Obviously open, we have 50 more minutes of the webinar. If anyone has questions, feel free to unmute and ask, put them in the chat. Um, yeah, we have Sven's time for another 15 minutes. Yeah, Yorick, go ahead.
Maybe more of a general question. If there's like a maximum budget for a call, would you usually advise to go to the maximum or not? I've heard
Yeah,
varying
yes.
advice.
Generally, I mean, generally, yes. Um, but it really depends on there's generally two strategies. So I'm in a few of these panels where we do the budget allocation. There's the strategy to pretty much go to the maximum of your budget. And what you tend to see is there's a maximum budget per project and there's a maximum budget that they will spend overall. And they will also say something about how many projects they intend to allocate. Say that's two, you know you need to take about half that budget. And if the maximum is much higher, you might be in trouble, right? Because then if two projects both do that, you know that's not going to work out. So you want to look at that and reallocate based on that information. Um, Very often funders will not tell you directly when you call them how much budget how much budget do you think I should allocate? What they will often tell you is how many projects they expect to allocate. If you know the maximum budget and you know that number, you can do the math yourself. So I would always call them and ask that question. This alternative strategy, if you have a very small project idea that does fit nicely into the call, don't hesitate to put it in as a very small one, because if there's a little bit of leftover budget, you might be the only project that's eligible. And you will get away with the remainder of the pot of money that didn't get used up. But that's only if that's actually feasible within that budget, right? Because it's no use doing something that or promising something with too little budget.
I have a question about under and overspending.
Mm-hmm.
If you budgeted a project and then for some reason you end up not doing a particular part, you have a load of allocated budget left over. Is there a way that that can be spent? Do you end up having to give it back? And conversely, if for some reason something turns out to be more expensive than you imagined, is there
Yeah, that's a
like
good one.
additional
So
funding available?
it really depends on the funding mechanism. In most science funding applications, EU, NSF, national funding agencies there is room to amend. So you could say if it's within, if you underspend on something and you overspend on something else, you might be able to reallocate. If you overspend on something very often and you don't underspend somewhere else, too bad. You're just in trouble. If it's about something that if you're doing something for instance, a government agency and they ask for more stuff that you didn't originally promise as a deliverable, you can easily ask for additional funding. And actually, the instrument is usually simpler because it is just uh, um, a extra bit of funding topped off on the original grant. So that's very simple to do in most commercial and government funding schemes because they just give you a little bit of extra work, essentially. They grant some extra funding for an extra bit of output that is related to what was already done. So the tendering process tends to be lighter. If you end up not doing something that you did say you would do in any sort of project, you should usually tell someone through a formal process. And if they agree to that, fine, then you get to keep the money. If they don't agree to that and say, give me the money back, well, yeah, sometimes that's an okay choice, right? It really depends. If you really didn't do it, you didn't hire anyone on that, you didn't spend any money on it, and you really don't want to do it, give the money back. Who cares? But if you if you did hire people for something and the money's already spent, you probably want to deliver on it anyway, even if you didn't like doing it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
just to connect with that, I think this is also something that usually your finance, when you say administrative personnel, knows a lot about. I felt like they kind of know when you can be flexible with things and when absolutely not. I don't have a lot of experience with it, but on these topics, I felt like they
Yeah,
know
and
quite
that's
a lot
why
of what's
generally,
possible.
yeah, I would really advise to have a good relationship with these people, but also really keep them in the loop more than anything. So if you're unsure, ask. That said, do also familiarize yourself with the actual grant rules because there is, even within funding organizations, there are so many instruments that sometimes they might not have read them exactly accurately and assumed based on previous knowledge what is allowed and what isn't. So read your agreements, read your call texts, read your grant texts, and see for yourself what is and isn't allowed as well. Because sometimes there is more flexibility than your financial controller might think based on previous experience. But that's only worth it if you really need that flexibility, right? If you don't need it, don't take it.
I have a question from Camille. Do you feel like each funding agency is very specific, or do you find some common ground across local, regional, and international agencies that help you apply the experience you gained from one project and recycle previous work during that project preparation, such as proposals when you're doing that? Like, do you have to start from scratch every time?
To some extent, yes, sadly enough. What you get, what helps, you slowly but surely develop a feel for how to do it, but more the how than the what, because the terms under what things can be funded are just different. They're even different within funding agencies, depending on what you apply for. So you really need to rethink that every time you do it. I would say within funding agencies, it is more consistent than among. So if you apply to EU Horizon funding, one is very comparable to the next one compared to, I don't know, a local government. There are things that are a few things do come back quite regularly. That is a overhead percentage, whether or not you need to account for value added taxes or not in it. A lot of those things do come up often. But no, I would say there are sadly enough. It's more about your own experience in dealing with this sort of stuff than it is about, oh yeah, I can just copy this from the last one.
I have a maybe quite specific question, but it occurred to me when you were talking about the different budget allocations. Where do things like um, article page charges come in? Like that can be quite a large expense, and you didn't mention it, and I wonder if there's a space
Yeah.
in the budget
Generally, they would fall under materials in one
materials.
way or the other. So what I think I call it labs. For some reason, I called it lab supplies, but it would
Hmm.
fall under that. So it's a one-time fee. They are not. These charges are not considered investments because they don't depreciate. Um, and yeah, they can get huge, and you need to figure out some nice way to put them in if you can. If you can, being an important one, because some funders will not allow you to.
Which is kind of crazy when a lot of these funders also want you to do open science. And a lot
Yeah.
of the big
And
open
then they
science
say,
journals.
yeah, but there are other places you can put it. You just put it in a non in a open access unpaid journal.
Right?
Maybe we can have opinions about that. And I think that's fair.
For the next webinar. Okay, another question. On average, in your job time, how much time do you spend doing this kind of project management? Do you feel that it's taking too much of your time rather than doing your science?
Too much. That's an interesting one. Um, does it take too much? So there's two questions there. There's how much time. It really depends on how much projects you're running, right? So um, I think generally speaking, I'd probably spend two to 3 days a week on this. Sadly enough. But that is that with I should mention there that is with being the principal coordinator of a 2040 2.8 million project. So that does sort of give you a perspective. That is not because it is always that much work. That is also, it's already starting to get a bit less, in my opinion. And it's hard to sometimes separate. There's the management side and the science side. So if you're in a startup to a new project, this can take a lot and a lot of time. Once the projects are running, it tends to ease up a bit. You can talk more about the science part. And then near the end, it's sometimes really a lot of management again, because you need to make sure everything's set up accountancy wise, you name it. That said, my literal job title was project manager. So this was technically what I was primarily paid to do. Um, I think I think it's more two days than three, to be honest. I think about 2 days a week in overall over the past, well, let's say 8 years or so. I would like to be doing more science, which is exactly why I am trying to shy away from this to some extent again. Um, yeah, that's a fair answer.
We have 2 minutes, probably time for one or two more questions.
Well, so maybe do, oh yeah, go ahead.
Hey Sven, this was really helpful. One of the things I'm still a little confused on is the idea of depreciation. Could you give an example of like what that looks like and how that might become an issue?
Yeah, so it's quite simple. If you bring it down to, for instance, your car, you buy a car, that car, if I sell it tomorrow, is not worth the same. If I sell it in 2 years, it's not worth the same. That is essentially depreciation in a nutshell. When that becomes an issue is if you say, I'm buying my car on the project, and next year I will keep the car, but it has leftover value. It might not be worth the same, but it still has value. The idea with depreciation is that over time you say at this point the car functionally has no value left to the company. So tax-wise, we've paid all of it off. Essentially, we're sort of taking a loan off on the car. We're paying that from the project, but then the project has to last as long as the loan. And if we still need to depreciate some of the car, but the project has ended, we're left with this either with this car that we now own but we haven't sold, or a deficit. And that's pure accounting, right? That is not functionally how things are in practice, but that is how accounting wise it would work. So either we would have to sell the car and hope we make back our money, or we keep the car, and then we have a deficit. Um, Very often the mistake we tend to make is thinking, but I reserved money for said car that paid for the entire car in my project. But seeing the car is being depreciated, it might not be depreciated fast enough, and then we cannot actually pay it within the amount of time that we had in the project to pay it off. Which is weird, which is essentially weird. I get the confusion. Um, because every item we buy, every piece of equipment you buy essentially is depreciated in a certain amount of time. Usually that is 4 to 5 years. After 5 years, we say, well, it's worth nothing. If we only have 3 years of projects, we still have 2 years of depreciation left. So 2/5 of the entire value of the item hasn't been paid for. And the budget on the project is no longer accessible because the project has ended. Yeah, accounting. I don't make the rules. This took me ages to understand, and I still don't really think it makes sense because the logical thing to do at that point, and that is possible, right, is to get an okay from your project to depreciate the entire item within the project duration. That is possible. So then you say, well, we'll buy this car, but actually we will be using it in such a way that we think after 3 years we can't realistically reuse it anymore. Are you okay with us depreciating it within this time? If they say yes, you book the entire car on the project, no issue. But again, you need to account for it. If you don't get that statement and your institute books it as something that depreciates over 5 years, and you only had 3 years of project, you're in trouble.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if that clarifies, but I hope it does.
It helps.
All right, we're at end here. I just want to thank Sven again for providing this really useful webinar. The recording will be available on the YouTube channel, I believe, on from GLEON, as soon as I figured out how to upload it. And yeah, hopefully we'll be with you again with another GPA webinar in the future. Thanks all for coming. We'll see you soon.